This is the Business Blackbook, where billion-dollar empires are built and collapse. 5 Zals Fod 4 Cent. That is how much the Bombay Stock Exchange surged between 1989 and 1992. 5,000%. And at the center of that impossible, gravity-defying rise stood one man. A man who wore suits that cost more than most Indians earned in a year. A man who drove a Lexus through the dusty streets of Mumbai when almost nobody in the country had even seen a Lexus. A man who told the press, without blinking, without shame, without a single tremor in his voice, every Indian should own stocks. His name was Harshad Mehta, and he was not just a stockbroker. He was an architect of the single greatest financial fraud ever perpetrated on the Indian subcontinent. A fraud so elegant, so audacious, so deeply embedded in the machinery of the Indian banking system that by the time the authorities understood what had happened, 10,000 crore rupees had already vanished. That is roughly 500 million United States dollars in 1992 money. But here is what makes this black book truly extraordinary. Harshad Mehta did not steal from the shadows. He did not operate in the dark. He operated in plain sight. On the front pages of every newspaper, on the television screens of every living room, with a smile so wide and a confidence so absolute that the entire country not only allowed it, they celebrated it. Let us open the ledger. On the very first page, we find a boy from a small town called Raipur. No silver spoon, no family connections, no elite education. Harshad Mehta arrived in Bombay in the late 1970s with nothing more than ambition and a mind that processed numbers the way a predator processes the movement of prey. He sold cement. He sold hosiery. He worked as a dispatch clerk. For years, he was invisible. But the stock market spoke to him. He joined a brokerage firm as a sub-broker in 1981, and within years, he had founded his own firm, Raipur Research and Asset Management. The name itself tells you everything about the man. He did not call it safe returns. He did not call it steady income. He called it grow more, because Harshad Mehta was not interested in modest gains. He was not interested in patience or prudence or the quiet accumulation of wealth that every textbook recommends. He was interested in domination, but to dominate the Bombay Stock Exchange, you need capital. Enormous, almost incomprehensible. Capital. And in 1992 India, that capital was locked inside one of the most bureaucratic, archaic, and crucially vulnerable systems on the planet, the Indian banking system. Turn to page 14 of the ledger. This is where the machinery of the fraud begins to hum. At the time, Indian banks were required to maintain a certain percentage of their deposits in government securities, safe instruments, bonds, treasury bills, the kind of boring financial products that keep a banking system stable and solvent. Banks were constantly buying and selling these securities among themselves, a process that required a middleman, a broker, someone who could connect a bank that needed to sell securities with a bank that needed to buy them. That broker was Harshad Mehta. Now, here is where the genius becomes sinister. In a legitimate transaction, a bank would hand Harshad a check made out to another bank, the one selling the securities. But the system was built on paper, on trust, on handshakes and telephone calls, and physical certificates that took days to move from one vault to another. And in that gap, in that beautiful, exploitable, catastrophic gap between the check being written and the securities being delivered, Harshad Mehta saw a door. He began convincing banks to write checks not to other banks, but directly to him, to his personal firms. His argument was elegant in its simplicity. The transaction takes time, he would say. Let me hold the funds. I will manage the settlement. Trust me. And the banks unbelievably did. Because Harshad Mehta had a reputation. Because Harshad Mehta had a track record. Because Harshad Mehta was the big bull. He had even given himself a nickname. Those checks. Those enormous government bank-issued checks worth hundreds of crore rupees were being funneled directly into the stock market. Harshad Mehta was using bank money, money that belonged to ordinary depositors, to artificially inflate the price of specific stocks. His favorite target? ACC, Associated Cement Companies. In less than 1 year, Harshad Mehta pumped the share price of ACC from 200 rupees to 9,000 rupees. Let that settle. A stock that was worth 200 rupees was, through the sheer gravitational force of manipulated buying, now worth 9,000. A 45-fold increase in a single company in under 12 months. And because the market was rising, because every headline screamed about the new India, the liberalizing India, the India of economic reform and foreign investment and a billion dreams finally within reach, nobody asked the question that needed to be asked. Where is this money coming from? This is what we call, in the language of the Black Book, a confidence architecture. It is not enough to steal. The truly sophisticated fraudster builds a world around the theft, a world so dazzling, so intoxicating, so seemingly real that the victims become voluntary participants. Harshad Mehta built that world with surgical precision. He moved into a 20,000 square foot mansion in Worli, one of the most expensive addresses in all of Bombay. He had a fleet of cars that included a Toyota Corolla, a Toyota Serra, a Lexus Starlet, and a Toyota Soarer, at a time when most Indians considered a scooter to be an aspiration. He held court like a king. Journalists came to him. Analysts sought his approval. Ordinary investors, millions of ordinary investors, followed his every move. He was quoted in newspapers saying things like, "I always play with the bulls," and the country nodded along. But the ink was already beginning to smudge. Deep inside the ledger, on a page that very few people were allowed to read, the numbers were beginning to contradict each other. The checks that should have moved between banks had not moved. The securities that should have been delivered had not been delivered. There were loans outstanding that had no collateral. There were transactions that existed only as promises. And one woman decided to look closer. Her name was Sucheta Dalal, a financial journalist for the Times of India. In April of 1992, she published a story, a single newspaper story. That story detonated like a bomb in the middle of the Indian financial system. She had traced the flow of funds. She had followed the paper trail through the labyrinth of interbank transactions and broker receipts and settlement slips. And she had found the door that Harshad Mehta had been walking through for years. Her article named names. It named numbers. It named the mechanism of the fraud with a clarity that no regulator had managed to achieve. Within days of publication, the Bombay Stock Exchange collapsed. Not corrected, not adjusted, collapsed. The index fell from 4,500 points to 2,500 points in a matter of weeks. Billions in market capitalization evaporated. The ordinary investors, the men and women who had believed Harshad Mehta when he said every Indian should own stocks, watched their savings dissolve into nothing. But here is the detail that truly belongs in the Black Book. Here is the detail that elevates this from mere fraud to something approaching tragedy. Many of the people who lost everything had invested their entire life savings based on Harshad Mehta's public pronouncements. He had appeared on television. He had written columns. He had been treated as a prophet. And when prophets fall, they do not fall alone. The ripple effects were catastrophic. Several banks reported massive shortfalls in their government securities portfolios. The State Bank of India, the largest bank in the country, discovered a shortfall of 500 crore rupees directly linked to the scam. National Housing Bank, UCO Bank, the Bank of Karad. Institution after institution began to unravel as the true scale of what had happened became clear. Turn now to the darkest page in this particular ledger. The total amount siphoned through fraudulent bank receipts, through fake securities transactions, through the systematic exploitation of a broken settlement system is estimated at approximately 4,000 crore rupees. Some estimates go higher. The exact number has never been conclusively established because the paper trail was itself a work of deliberate obfuscation. 4,000 crore rupees at 1992 valuations. Moved quietly, systematically, brilliantly through a system that was built to prevent exactly this kind of theft, but had never actually been tested against a mind as precise and as predatory as Harshad Mehta's. He was arrested in November of 1992, but the story does not end there, because the Black Book never closes on a simple arrest. What followed was one of the most labyrinthine legal proceedings in Indian judicial history. Harshad Mehta was charged in connection with 27 criminal cases and over 600 civil action suits. The investigation consumed decades. It involved the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Income Tax Department, the Reserve Bank of India, and a joint parliamentary committee that produced a report so damning, so detailed, so comprehensive in its indictment of systemic failure that it was largely ignored. Because the uncomfortable truth, the truth that sits at the very bottom of this particular ledger, is that Harshad Mehta could not have done what he did alone. The banks that handed him checks made out in his name did not do so blindly. The officials who processed those transactions were not all incompetent. The system that he exploited was not merely inadequate by accident. It was inadequate by design, maintained in a state of strategic obscurity by people who benefited from its opacity. This is the pattern that the Black Book has seen repeated across every continent and every century. The truly great frauds are never solo performances. They are collaborations between the predator and the prey, between the criminal and the system, between the man who finds the door and the institution that quietly, deliberately leaves it unlocked. Harshad Mehta, to his dying day, maintained a defiant posture that was almost admirable in its audacity. While out on bail, while facing hundreds of criminal charges, while the Indian financial system was still reeling from the earthquake he had caused, he launched a website. He published stock tips. He gave interviews. He pointed fingers at politicians. He claimed he had paid a bribe of 1 crore rupees to the then Prime Minister's office. He claimed he was not a thief. He claimed he was a scapegoat. Whether that claim contains any truth is a question that Indian courts wrestled with for years. What is not in question? What the numbers make absolutely and unambiguously clear is that the mechanism he operated was fraudulent, that the money he used did not belong to him, that the wealth he displayed so ostentatiously, the mansion, the Lexus, the suits, the celebrity, was built on a foundation of stolen capital. But here is the final lesson that the Black Book offers in the case of Harshad Mehta, the lesson that distinguishes him from a common thief, the lesson that makes his story worth telling in 2025. In an era of algorithmic trading and digital assets and decentralized finance, and 1,000 new systems that carry within them the same fundamental vulnerability that he exploited in 2092. The vulnerability is not technological. It is not regulatory. It is not even institutional. It is human. The vulnerability is the human desire to believe in the miracle, to believe that someone has discovered a secret that the rest of us missed, to believe that the number going up will never come down, to watch a man drive a Lexus through a city of scooters and conclude not that something is wrong, but that you want to be the next one in that car. Harshad Mehta understood that vulnerability with a precision that most psychologists never achieve. He did not just steal money. He sold a story about a new India, about liberation and growth, and the democratization of wealth. And the story was so beautiful and so expertly told that millions of people bought it willingly, eagerly. He died on December 31st, 2001. In judicial custody in Thane Civil Hospital, he was 47 years old. At the time of his death, the courts had convicted him in only one of the more than 600 cases filed against him. The rest died with him, unresolved, incomplete, like entries in a ledger that was never properly closed. His wife continued the legal battles for years after. His family maintained his innocence. The system that enabled him was reformed, slowly, imperfectly. The Securities and Exchange Board of India strengthened. The settlement processes modernized. The interbank transaction protocols tightened. The Bombay Stock Exchange, which he had turned into his personal instrument, became one of the most regulated exchanges in Asia. Progress was made. Changes were implemented. Lessons were supposedly learned. And yet, the next scandal came, and the one after that, and the one after that. Because the Black Book has been recording human nature for as long as there have been ledgers to write in. And human nature does not update its operating system simply because one genius fraudster died in custody. The greed persists. The vulnerability persists. The beautiful, terrible, irresistible story always persists. On the last page of the Harshad Mehta ledger, written in fading ink, is not a number. It is not a charge sheet. It is not a conviction. It is a question. The question that every investor, every regulator, every ordinary person putting their savings into a market must ask themselves when they see a number that seems too extraordinary to be real. When they see a man in a Lexus telling them that everyone should own stocks. When they see 5,000% gains and 45-fold returns in a bull market that seems to have no ceiling and no end. The question is simply this: who is paying for this miracle? Because somewhere in every miracle, there is a ledger. And somewhere in that ledger, there is a page that has not been shown to you yet. A page written in someone else's money. A page that will eventually, inevitably be turned. The big bull is gone, but the blueprint remains. And somewhere right now, in some city, in some exchange, in some digital marketplace that did not exist when Harshad Mehta was driving his Lexus through the streets of Bombay, someone is reading that blueprint and smiling. And with that, the Black Book closes. Subscribe, and we will open the next page soon.